Roly Keating, I'm Chief Executive here at the British Library. It is wonderful to see you all gathered here. Welcome to those of you who've been in sessions in other parts of the building. Welcome back to this auditorium. We hope that you have enjoyed a full day of rich, inspiring talks and conversations. This is the third year that the London edition of the Lahore Literary Festival has been hosted here at the British Library, and it is something of which we are very, very proud indeed. It's become genuinely a vital part of the annual calendar here, of the sharing of ideas, heritage, art, literature, contemporary ideas. Here at the British Library, you will have, if you walked over the piazza, you've walked over at least 4 stories of shelves and archives with many, many kilometers more elsewhere, some 170 million physical items and growing all the time. This is a treasure house of memory, but we're determined that it does not just gather dust. Our mantra here is living knowledge. We're custodians of the intellectual heritage that we hold here on behalf of the world, and we want to put it to work for stimulus and imagination and ideas. We describe our purpose here as being to advance knowledge and mutual understanding. And what better way to do that than events like this, days like this, with so many common threads of history, memory, and culture coming together. I just want to thank Razi Ahmed, the director of the festival, his very talented team, all the supporters and sponsors who make it happen every year, for making for helping to come together another great program of diverse and fascinating contributions. The day is very much not over. Later this evening, 7:30 in this theatre, to conclude the festival will be an evening of beautiful Qawwali song from the brilliant Sami Brothers Qawwal. Those of you who do not have tickets, there are still 1 or 2 left for that. But now, it is my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote talk for the day. And it's going to be delivered by one of the most distinguished academics in America or globally on the history, culture, and politics of South Asia. A specialist in many themes, including decolonization, Muslim identities, a MacArthur Fellow, the author of many, many books, most recently The Struggle for Pakistan. She is the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, and her talk tonight for the Lahore Literary Festival is called Past Presentism, History and the Recovery of the Imagination. Please welcome Ayesha Jalal. Ayesha.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very grateful to the LLF team, and especially Razi Ahmed, for inviting me to this 4th literary festival in London. I'm sorry I wasn't able to come last year, but I've tried to compensate for it by being here. This was agreed on a year ago. I also want to thank the British Library for the excellent location, the venue. It's a real privilege and honor to be able to give this keynote address. We live in a so-called post-truth world, but do we also live in a post-human world? What is clear, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is that we inhabit not just a divided and deeply disturbing world, but one that has become utterly devoid of any pretense of moral conscience. The death of conscience is amply in evidence around the globe and is fashioning so-called new normals that, far from being normal, are against the basic standards of human decency. Modern states have been steadily acquiring increasingly more sophisticated technologies and are deploying unprecedented means of surveillance and securitization through structures of command and control to secure the compliance, if not the capitulation, of entire populations. Walling borders to keep out immigrants, terrorists, arms, drugs, or militarizing restive territories before forcibly annexing them are more indicative of the declining capacities of state power in our late modern era. In the face of the challenges of globalization and internal political discord, rather than signs of the effective exercise of national sovereignty and state power, as is often mistakenly believed. Human history has been witness to the elevating as well as repressive and limiting aspects of identities. Narrowly construed identities thrive on narratives of hate and exclusion. If identity politics, together with crass consumerism, blind people to the suffering of others, it entails a denial of humanity to those demonized for asserting difference and dissent. The reason for this is in large part is the overwhelming force of presentism, a sense of the present that is oblivious of the multiple ways in which the past informs our everyday life and politics, and the instant flows of information in our fast-moving and unevenly globalizing world. The rise of authoritarian populisms and anti-immigrant and anti-everything exclusionary nationalisms is alarming. What that portends for the world rapidly making strides in the technologies of control and manipulation is anyone's guess. Just consider the media's fascination with strong leaders, a preoccupation that erases the weak and unfortunate populace, reduced at best to a statistical category that can be measured and manipulated. If the political, in combination with an exclusionary populism in the guise of nationalism, is showing signs of becoming increasingly personal and authoritarian, what does this portend then for public discourse and the multitudinous discontents finding expression on social media, a new potent and double-edged sword that is fashioning contemporary iterations of globalization in uncertain ways? These large questions are contextually specific, even if it is possible to discern broadly common sources of popular discontent the world over. Nuclearized South Asia had been quivering on the brink since February of this year. Developments, of course, took a dangerously depressing turn in the subcontinent, as has been amply pointed to earlier, since New Delhi's controversial annexation and bifurcation of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir on 5th August. The deafening silence and that shrouds the Kashmir issue loudly advertises the international community's abject abandonment of all ethical considerations in the name of state security. One could say that the same is happening with the Uyghurs, it's happening across much of the world. Kashmir's looming presence, however, in South Asia's near and distant future can be wished away, as is being attempted to be done by preventing Twitter sites that talk about Kashmir. But Kashmir's looming presence can't simply be wished away. And if it is, it will be at a grave risk of the regional and of regional security and as well as global security. Kashmir is not the only problem posing a serious challenge to the subcontinent's collective wisdom and conscience. But its long-standing lack of resolution has ensured that it now impacts most, if not all, the other problems in South Asia. If the sources of contemporary discontentment in South Asia are varied, what is striking is the presentism underpinning analysis and policy making. Public discourse, official and non-official, as well as popular sentiment, finding expression in social media, are almost exclusively focused on existing discontents. Presented to a bemused audience with a dizzying diet of distractions and diversions in the form of daily news and a globalized consumerism, the public discourse is not only varied, but challenged by the dissident wave that has taken to the new information technologies with alacrity. These technologies are in themselves helping fuel the presentism informing popular perceptions of the political today. What is sought is instant information, not the labors of the mind obtained by poring over reams of disintegrating parchment and fragile pieces of paper to gather information that can generate knowledge. This is not a call for a rush to the archives by any stretch of the imagination, far less one for reclusive introspection. Rather, I'm pointing to an attitude of mind which, in obfuscating the singular importance of historical consciousness, turns a blind eye to its vital role in formulating the questions we pose and the answers we may or may not find. The tendency to arrive at instant conclusions, belied both by history and the existential evidence, is preventing a more judicious understanding of the current impasse, undermining efforts to move towards an effective and sustainable resolution of the malaise that affects the states that inherited the institutional and ideational legacies of the British colonial state. The need is particularly urgent today when the post-colonial states of South Asia, in different measure, are facing challenges from social and political groupings who, even when not openly rejecting democracy, subvert the basic ideals of freedom of speech and religious consciousness by invoking exclusionary loyalties and false readings of canonical texts, often at the grave expense of the ever-moving target of the other. A binding theme of my talk today is the discernible closing of the mind that has accompanied the recent turn towards authoritarianism in several parts of the world, but especially South Asia. What is commonplace, it's quite commonplace to sort of bemoan the partition of India in one breath, and the failings of Pakistan in the other. But most people today simply cannot fathom why Imran Khan, the famous international cricketing hero who captained his country's team to its only World Cup victory, is not the universal favorite of all his compatriots. Much the same sort of surprise attends the ascent of Narendra Modi, once debarred from traveling to the United States of America for his role in the killings of Muslims in Gujarat, but now walking hand in hand with Donald Trump in a Houston football stadium before a fawning crowd of diasporic Indians. Beyond performative leadership and a monotony of official handshakes and embraces lies a grimmer and mounting crisis of not just democratic deconsolidation, but democratic irrelevance, a process that formalizes the irrelevance of the voter in the aftermath of elections. The voter's right to punish the representatives in the next round of elections is reassuring, but can be overridden in countries where the non-elected institutions have a large say in the election process. For instance, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and some might even want to add India, but maybe by a longer shot. Beyond the drama of elections and formal arenas of politics in South Asia are more enduring signs of the dangerously narrowing space for public discourse. Well before news of Muslims being lynched by mobs in India for allegedly possessing or eating beef struck a blow to the international image of the world's largest democracy, the state and military-dominated Pakistan had relinquished responsibility to protect the lives of its citizens. In the aftermath of September 11, the attacks in the United States, and Pakistan's official withdrawal of support for the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, militants reared by the state's own intelligence agencies to fight proxy wars in neighboring countries turned against their paymasters. Following a standoff between the military and extremists holed up in the capital's Lal Masjid, or Red Mosque complex, in July of 2007, disaffected militants went on a violent spree in which even the highest of high were not spared. A new poison began drowning a sense of reasonableness and safety in the highly securitized land of the pure. January 4th, 2011, started off as an ordinary day in the bracing warmth of the Lahore winter sun, when all sense of peace and quiet suddenly came crashing down. The governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, a veteran supporter of the Pakistan People's Party, was gunned down by one of his own elite force guards in broad daylight in the capital city of Islamabad. Malik Mumtaz Hussain Qadri, the assassin, justified his heinous deed by proclaiming his victim a blasphemer to whom he had given a befitting punishment. It would have been possible to ignore this babbling nonsense if not for the almost instant support that Qadri garnered among the vocal pockets in Pakistan, including, ironically enough, among the lawyers of Punjab who had earlier or very recently won their democratic spurs by opposing a military ruler's attempts to depose a sitting Chief Justice. More disturbing than the vocal supporters of Mumtaz Qadri were the many who remained silent rather than condemn, not for the first time in Pakistan's history, one of the grossest travesties of security in a highly securitized state. Was Qadri acting on his religious worldview, however distorted, or promoting an ideology of hatred speciously attributed to Islam? And what are we to make of those black-coated lawyers who hailed his action, threatened judges, and disrupted court proceedings that were going against Qadri? Such uncivil behavior is directly linked to the attitude of the law-enforcing agencies, some of whom harbor sympathy for the goons of right-wing groups who use a fig leaf of religion for legitimacy. These struggles are unlikely to disappear anytime soon, and as compelling as fanciful theories are to the public, I think we can anticipate the outcomes better by understanding them in the light of history. Misconstrued as religious zeal, this exclusivist stance has more rational motivations. While there's nothing new about the exclusionary strain in public discourse in the South Asian subcontinent, the more recent manifestations of bigotry underscore the growing disconnect between time-honored axioms of nationalism, good government, and actual administrative practices. Pakistan is a good case in point, and one that can serve as a cautionary tale for India, where religion and the state had maintained a formal separation in theory, if not necessarily in political practice. The spread of illiberal thinking in Pakistan is a much more recent phenomenon than is realized by those who attribute its current malaise to the very fact of partition. The closing of the mind that has paralleled the restricted space for free political expression was not coeval with Pakistan's birth. With the shift in global perceptions of Pakistan from a moderate pro-Western country dominated by the military into an unstable nuclearized state that is the font of Islamic terror, most analysts attribute religious impulses or read religion into what are effectively strategic responses, strategic decisions. Pakistan was not always in the shambles that it seems to be in today. The qualitative shift that occurred was in the 1980s and was a response to hardcore geostrategic imperatives, not the embrace of some newfangled religious doctrine. This is not to deny the long-standing tussle between the ideologues of an Islamic state in Pakistan, variously defined, and those who want a moderate, forward-looking and democratic country in keeping with the vision of the founder of Pakistan. But there was a world of difference between Pakistan in the 1960s and 1970s and Pakistan after Zia-ul Haq. This is well captured in Dhanak, a satirical short story written during the heyday of General Ayub's modernizing military regime. Authored by the free-thinking Urdu writer Ghulam Abbas, the short story Dhanak was a warning against the dangers posed by the forces of reaction to rational thought and progress. Better known for his short story Anandi, which became the basis for the screen script of Shyam Benegal's film Mandi, Abbas's Dhanak has proven to be so prophetic that it merits an airing at this literary festival, not least because of the present conjuncture in global politics. Towards the end of the 20th century, at a swinging party in the Hanging Gardens on the 71st floor of Karachi's Hotel Mohenjo-daro, diplomats from all over the world learned that Pakistan had stolen the march over everyone else and sent a man, Adam Khan, to the moon, long before Vikram made a hard landing and was stunned to eternal silence. Astounded by such an unexpected turn of events, the diplomats graciously congratulate their jubilant hosts, and the party goes on into the wee hours of the morning. But just before the dawn of dusk, many miles away from Karachi, a village mullah tells the congregation after morning prayers that he has just heard on the radio that some Pakistani degenerate had landed on the moon. Condemning this as an act of perfidy by a depraved government, the mullah predicts the end of the world. Within hours, mullahs in rural and urban mosques are slamming the moon landing, using their well-honed and well-acknowledged oratorical skills to rally ever larger numbers of listeners. It was not long before the mullahs had gained sufficient street power and began to shift the narrative from censoring the moon landing specifically to turning it into an all-out attack on the government, which was accused of lacking religiosity and therefore the right to rule over a Muslim country. This alarmed government officials, who until then had been too busy with the outpourings of congratulations coming in from all corners of the world, to pay much heed to the mullah agitation, because local mullahs were known to change tack very quickly if given the proverbial halwa. But on this occasion, the government, known to change tack, the government collapsed after attempts to placate the mullahs fail. And they can't turn the popular tide. The mullahs have won. So once elections are held, ulama parties in their myriad colors join the fray. The green, the red, the blue, the yellow, black, and white combinations held an edge over multicolored others. Thus the title of the story, Dhanak, rainbow, political rainbow. The elections are won by the Green Party, whose Amir, or leader, has the loudest voice, and steps are taken to ensure that his voice booms constantly across the country. Pakistan is soon turned into a hardline theocratic state with a sweeping crackdown on anything deemed to be quote-unquote Western, a shorthand for everything remotely associated with creativity or innovative and critical thinking. Entertainment is an early casualty. The closing down of cinema halls, theaters, museums, and parks is accompanied by the abolition of the educational system and its replacement with religious seminaries where students are taught fiqh, hadith, tafsir, sharia, and Quranic recitation. Arabic is declared the official language of Pakistan. Women, of course, bear the brunt of mullah power, losing their basic freedoms, including the right to an education. The legal profession is abolished, along with court fees, a popular measure aimed at gaining popular mileage, political mileage. Judges and magistrates are replaced by mullahs and qazis, doctors and nurses by hakims, leaving women with no access to medical care. With the mullahs at the helm, Islamization is so all-pervasive that even romantic poetry, considered harmful for the morals of young women, is excised from the literature and supplanted by religious hymns, elegies, and national lullabies. Cartoons, music, painting, photography, and sculpture are proscribed. All sports associated with Western influence, including the national passion, cricket, are banned. All modern amenities are rejected. Even toothpaste ceases to be an item of social consumption. Pakistanis obey the tyrannical dictums of the mullahs with forbearance, with the result that there is a distinctive increase in piety. There is an unprecedented hike in mosque attendance and signs of Arabization. Young boys dressed in Arabic-style robes go around the city with swords hanging by their waists and singing, "The crescent sword is our national symbol." With religious strictures and military nationalism keeping people in check, the government takes a perilous decision to abolish interest, forcing the entire banking system to collapse and resulting in the complete suspension of international trade. But what eventually brings down Pakistan's mullahcracy is the sheer weight of internal religious disputes among the different mullah groups. These take the form of verbal debates and then break down into fistfights before evolving into violent attacks, including one in which a mujtahid from one group is killed. The murderer is never found. One day, the Amir of the incumbent Green Party is found murdered in a mosque. Unimaginable violence ensues, and until one day, the sounds of tanks and planes, which are not those of the Pakistani armed forces, but of an unnamed country, can be heard. Several years later, in a barren landscape with no human habitation in sight over vast stretches, a group of American or maybe British tourists are shown the stone marking the site where once stood the Hotel Mohenjo-daro, from where the world heard of Pakistan's famous landing on the moon. When in 1967, Ghulam Abbas first read the story at the Halqa-e Arbab-e-Zauq, circle of people with good taste, in Lahore, right-wing writers and critics panned him for a wanton incendiary attack on religion and the sectarian divisions in Islam. Their refrain was, quote, "No Muslim can ever conceive killing religious leaders or bombing mosques." In June 1969, Abbas responded to his detractors in the preface to the second edition of Dhanak, affirming his membership in the Islamic millet and noting that like his illustrious mentor, Allama Muhammad Iqbal, he too rejected all sectarian differences. He had merely written a story about the dangers he thought Muslims were facing because that was his craft. Iqbal had counseled his countrymen long ago against apathy, disunity, and sectarianism. Na samjhoge, to mit jaoge, eh Hindustan walo, tumhari dastan tak na hogi dastanon mein. If you don't understand, you will be eradicated, O people of Hindustan. Even your story will not be part of history. While it recently gained some popularity after being dramatized and performed by a Jhoka theatre under the title Hotel Mohenjo-daro, this veritable icon of the Pakistani national canon remains conspicuously missing from a number of collections of Ghulam Abbas's short stories. In the bitter political and ideological polarization of the Ayyub era, Abbas's literary imagination had constructed a chilling prospect, more by way of a warning than a prediction of future Talibanization. The right wing's embittered response to Dhanak was an early sign of the dulling of the imagination in Pakistan as it went through bouts of one military rule after another. The stalwarts of a progressive Pakistan persisted in exposing the mistruths of Mullaism before the religious rights brand of politics and public discourse found a more receptive and nurturing environment under another military ruler who exposed the country to the hazards of fighting other people's wars. Safdar Mir, who took the pen name Zeno and wrote for the Pakistan Times until he fell foul of Ziaul Haq's military regime in 1977, was one of the first to take on, he was one of the sharpest critics of Mullaism in the 60s and 70s. Among the issues he took on with special urgency was the misappropriation of Muhammad Iqbal by right-wing writers and professionals, as well as polemicists. When Iqbal attacked the mullah, Zeno Safdar Mir noted, he was not challenging Islam, but rather the static and changeless view of life and society of which the mullah had become the exponent and defender. The mullah saw this not as an attack on himself, but on the religion of Islam. And even now, when every mullah has become an Iqbalite, he identifies Islam with himself. Anybody criticizing the thinking of our modern mullahs is charged with being critical of Islam itself. This is what Iqbal slammed. Yet, the man whose philosophy begins and ends, quote, begins and ends with the vision of Islam as revolution and change is now being harnessed to the purpose of counter-revolution and the vision of an unchanging, immutable Islamic system whose features can be easily recognized in the neo-colonialist strategy of John Foster Dulles, unquote. Iqbal satirized the mullahs' incomprehension in various poems, reacting to their barbs in increasingly more derisive ways. Deen-e mullah fi sabilillah fasad, Kabe ka Brahman, mullah ki azan aur, mujahid ki azan aur, hai baad-e amuzi-e aqwam-o milal kam iska, main janta hu anjam uska, jis marke mein mullah ho ghazi. The religion of the mullah is strife in the way of Allah. Brahmins of the Kaaba. The mullah's call to prayer is different from the warriors. Miserable and deficient are his works. I know the end of any enterprise in which the mullah is the warrior of the faith. His penetrating critique of the bearded men of religion who had made a mockery of Islam, coupled with Ghulam Abbas's chilling prophecy, are reason enough to reject narratives dismissing Pakistan as flawed in its very conception and therefore destined to fail. This is presentism in the double sense of reducing the complexities of the past to the single narrative frame of the here and now, and also of interpreting today exclusively in the light of present preoccupations. Instead of flattening history and attributing Pakistan's multiple ills to the fact of its creation, we will be much better served by understanding the combination of factors, political, religious, and geostrategic, that saw the decade of the 1980s ushering in changes that altered the ideological balance between left-leaning socialism and right-wing ideologies. A tottering military ruler used the slogan of Islamization to consolidate his own hold over power. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan catapulted Zia, an international pariah, for hanging Zulfikar Ali Bhutto into the US-backed strongman of a frontline state, despite the fact that just a few months earlier, he had opted for a leisurely cycling spree around the capital rather than send his men to douse the burning fires at the American embassy. The transformation of Pakistan from a relatively moderate Muslim state into the hub of Muslim terrorist groups took place with the blessings of the centers of global capitalism and military prowess, preoccupied with defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan. The Afghan war, it must be underlined, was not a popular cause in Pakistan. But with the state's active support for Islamist groups fighting the Soviets, it was not long before it had impacted political discourse and the political, public discourse and the political. Needing recruits to fight the US-backed proxy war against the Soviets, Zia cemented the military mullah alliance, granting public land for religious seminaries to promote a jihadist ideology consistent with Pakistan's strategic objectives. A state-sponsored Islamization was a political tactic that allowed Zia to justify his stay in power through increasingly egregious modifications of the public discourse. Significantly, Zia and his cohorts, actually aware of the regime's lack of mass popularity, even considered banning the word political from public discourse. While this project had to be aborted for practical reasons, the more enduring effect of the Zia era was the closing of public space and ideological-driven efforts aimed at privileging authoritarian and highly conservative interpretations of Islam. In 1984, when Zia banned Ahmadis from using Islamic terminology and made blasphemy punishable with life imprisonment, there were only a handful of cases under the blasphemy provision of the Colonial Penal Code of 1860. Once the blasphemy law was amended in 1992, making a death penalty mandatory, there was an exponential increase in the number of blasphemy cases. Charges of blasphemy, more often than not, have proven to be a cover for settling personal scores and localized power struggles. No one is safe from the charge. Most of the blasphemy cases are against Muslims, but Ahmadis and Christians have borne the brunt disproportionately. Presentist comment on Pakistan's blasphemy laws has led some observers to suggest that they have such widespread popular support that changing these laws will place the state at serious risk, both in terms of adverse political outcry and the political fallout. Zealous mobs expressing outrage against would-be blasphemers might seem to prove the point. Laws are meant to protect citizens, not make them targets of virulent predators. The blasphemy laws have led to the death of not just the governor of the country's largest and most powerful province, but also of Shehbaz Bhatti, the Christian Federal Minister for Minority Affairs. Scores of people have and continue to be booked under these laws, which remain one of the biggest obstacles to free speech and civil exchange in Pakistan. The assassination of the progressive human rights activist and social worker, Sabeen Mahmood, because she spoke freely, in Karachi, followed by the tragic mob killing of Mashal Khan, the young Pakhtun freethinker, whose only transgression was non-conformity to the narratives of bigotry did shock segments of society and drew condemnations. However, the damage done to the delicate weave of Pakistan's social fabric is too severe to be repaired anytime soon. The Supreme Court's December 2018 overturning of the sentence of Asia Bibi has justly been hailed by human rights activists, but the judicial ruling is more a symbolic gesture aimed at the international community than the dawn of openness and moderation in Naya Pakistan. Meanwhile, Modi's new India, whether perceived as shining, rising, or frolicking, has seen an unprecedented degree of political polarization aimed at amid a growing crescendo of minority baiting and anti-Pakistan vitriolic. This has been made possible through a noxious nexus between right-wing majoritarian politics, a corporate-owned news media that is indebted to the BJP government, and India's sprawling cinematic world, most notably Bollywood. The antecedents to uncivil and jingoistic tendencies in secular democratic India are of course traceable to the 1980s, with the Congress regime's mishandling of the Shabano verdict and the opening of the doors of the Ayodhya mosque, leading eventually to the destruction of the Babri Masjid. Yet there is clear evidence of a change of tactics, from militarily bludgeoning a weaker regional neighbor into submission to fashioning the diplomatic isolation of an increasingly irksome nuclear rival. Whatever the wisdom of New Delhi's policies, there can be no doubt that India under Modi is a very different country than it had been when either Vajpayee or Manmohan Singh were at the helm. One of the key differences is the relative significance of the region's history in the political calculations, one of the insignificance in the region's political, in the political calculations of the BJP government. History does not matter as much. The Indian narrative under Modi is quite simply that Pakistan, which was always a mistake, is today a failed and above all, an irrelevant state. With news anchors and India's innumerable superstars, stars and starlets joining in this refrain. The few Indian celebrities who dared question the recent spate of Muslim and Dalit lynchings have received death threats and had charges of sedition, since now withdrawn, slapped against them for allegedly tarnishing India's image internationally, undermining Modi's impressive performance as Prime Minister and supporting secessionist tendencies. These are charges of those who raised their voices against the BJP's policies. Small wonder that for many, India today is not just the world's largest, but the world's heaviest democracy. In these dire times, where there is neither the uplifting rhetoric of anti-colonial nationalism, nor the reassuring words of leaders committed to upholding human rights and democratic norms, there is nothing to prevent the collective suicide of individual conscience. The dehumanization of entire populations that necessarily ensures that the psychological state of the victimized is reflected in the minds of the oppressors despite the imbalance of power, the clamoring of bare steel against the fragile bodies of desperate, unarmed human beings reduced to pelting stones to defend themselves against unbridled exercise of power. In such desperate times, literature can alleviate pain and allow for some imaginative reprieve, even if it entails administering a shock to the mind to bring it out of its complacency. Recovering historical imagination in fiction, for me, at this moment, being it a literary festival, is irresistible. In a satirical and far-sighted Imano Ikan, Peace and Certainty, written in the form of a series of radio announcements, Saad Hasan Manto, the Urdu short story writer, derided the United States and the Soviet Union for their nuclear brinkmanship, destroying other countries in their relentless quest for world dominance. The essay begins with the UN announcing the resolution of the dispute between the two superpowers from its headquarters in Lake Success. Abandoning their Cold War rhetoric, they agreed to prove their military prowess in earnest by launching the military missiles against each other's territory. As military technicians on both sides guide the trajectory of the weapons which have been launched, the UN Security Council goes into continuous session until the two sides agree to save themselves from mutually assured destruction and send the bombs to a less fortunate part of the world. The ill-fated region where the bombs are directed, turns out to be the recently divided South Asian subcontinent. With the burning stars descending menacingly from the sky, the two countries mobilized their men of religion to start emergency communications with the heavens, while also digging underground cellars and trenches for safety. The essay concludes with Seventh Heaven, Radio Seventh Heaven, questioning the religious faith and piety of the earthly supplicants who, while fervently praying towards heaven, are boring Mother Earth with gigantic deep holes and dark tunnels. In recent months, Indo-Pakistan tensions have mounted. Even if the immediate threat of war can be dismissed, there's little in the situation to reassure one that conflict may not break out, if not by human volition, then possibly through human fallibility and the potential for miscalculation and accident in such a high decibel and complex standoff between two embittered nuclear-armed states. With the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A without any reference to the people of Kashmir, whose representatives have been hurled into jail under punitive, lawless laws, to use a Gandhian phrase, there have been strident calls in the Indian media for military action to retake the part of Kashmir under Pakistan's jurisdiction, and worse still, for stopping the flow of water to Pakistan. This is something recently said by the Prime Minister himself, and even some have gone so far at hinting at a nuclear first strike. In his story, Yazid, evocatively translated as When the Waters Will Flow Again, Manto provides a deep psychological insight into Indo-Pakistan animosities. The protagonist, Karim Dad, lost his father in the violence of partition in Punjab, but sees no reason to blame anyone. We are responsible for whatever has happened to us. On hearing news of a war between India and Pakistan, following India's decision to divert the water from Pakistani Punjab, Karim Dad tries dampening the xenophobic rhetoric of his fellow villagers, rejecting their perception of India's threatened blockade of the river water, to the legendary cruelty of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid towards the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, and his followers at Karbala. He questions the realism of the villagers by asking the headman how a country considered to be an inveterate enemy could be expected to show any kindness. On returning home to find his wife, who had just given birth to a son, Karim Dad names the boy Yazid, to the disbelief of his wife and the midwife. When the wife questions him for his unreasonableness, he retorts, "It's just a name. It's not necessary that he too will be the same Yazid. That Yazid shut the river waters. This one will make the waters flow again." Balakot is in many ways the epicenter of jihad in South Asia. So reads the opening sentence of my book, Partisans of Allah, Jihad in South Asia. And I continue, quoting, "Blanketed by green terrace fields and thick dark forests, this beautiful town is situated about 18 miles from the city of Mansehra in the northwest frontier province, now the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of Pakistan. Situated on the banks of the river Kunhar, it serves as a gateway to the picturesque Kagan Valley, which is bounded on the east and the south by Kashmir." Unquote. 188 years have passed since the fateful morning of May 6, 1831, when Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli and Shah Ismail charged out into the battlefield to embrace martyrdom. A post-mortem of that jihad revealed the huge gap between the high ideals of the movement and its tragic end by internecine conflict among Muslims. Any lessons from that insight have not, it seems, been learnt because of the eulogistic and nostalgic fog that envelops the martyrs of Balakot. Those who decided to strike Balakot in the early morning hours of February of 26th of this year had also learnt quite the wrong lessons from history. The camps honoring Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli that I had written off in my book had long been swept away by the massive earthquake of 2005. The first brazen violation in nearly 50 years of Pakistan's sovereign territory by India's Mirage fighter jets is said to have resulted in some bomb craters splintered pine trees, and one solitary injured villager, rather than confer martyrdom on hundreds of alleged terrorists eager for a place in paradise. While attracted towards Shah Ismail's intellect and Sayyid Ahmad's spirituality, the great Urdu and Persian poet Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib had refused to join an armed struggle, preferring instead the struggle of the pen to that of the sword. Ghalib deployed the theme of martyrdom to engage in a struggle to achieve the elementary virtues of humanity, insaniyat. He lamented, "Dhamki mein mar gaya jo nabaab-e naburd tha, ishq-e naburd pesha talabgar-e mard tha." He died of threats who was not a courageous warrior. Love calls for a man whose profession is warfare. For Ghalib, to die in the struggle for love was the ultimate form of martyrdom. Martyrdom also means bearing witness, and it is now the only option left for Kashmiris in the valley who have been unjustly forced into an inhuman silence, their communications with loved ones and the rest of the world suspended by the fiat of an elected government dancing to the tunes of a majoritarian democracy that celebrates terrorizing those it calls citizens in the name of national security. Most remarkable are the ecstatic and unthinkingly jingoistic pronouncements of democratic India's mainstream media, which is taking the post-truth world to uncharted territories of deceit and deception that are reminiscent of the Third Reich's propaganda machinery. But whatever the distraction presently presented domestically, whatever distraction, whatever spins you give it, and whichever way they may choose to present it, there is no denying the extreme state of provocation that Modi-Shah Doval trio has created in the region by holding 8 million Kashmiris in a dehumanizing and relentless lockdown. With the international community doing precious little to stop New Delhi and Islamabad from doing the unthinkable, scholars and students of South Asia and beyond have to wield their pen with even greater vigor than ever against the bigotry and jingoism dripping from statist narratives. If unbridled presentism is not to signal the death of imagination, historians in particular must rise to the challenge of going past presentism in search of a humanistic understanding of South Asia's current predicament. Unless the political drift in the situation that seems to be taking in India is challenged, the chances of public warmongering are going to grow appreciably. Anything is possible in such times, including politically engineered conflicts across borders that can so easily go awry. Given the passions undergirding the historic conflict over Kashmir, it is pertinent to again invoke Manto's poignant piece written in Lahore on 9th November 1952, commemorating the great Kashmiri poet Mahjoor. Manto thought it strange that Pakistan and India were fighting over Kashmir and the UN was trying to mediate. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru is a Kashmiri like me and loves Kashmir as I do, like any other Kashmiri does. If Mahjoor had been alive today, I think there would have been no need for Dr. Graham. That sentiment is still alive today, and if one can dare say, at a time of a nationalistically driven moral and intellectual meltdown, silently popular in large swathes of the subcontinent. It's a sentiment that needs to be seized upon so that New Delhi and Islamabad, instead of scoring debating points against each other for political gain, can move towards some sort of a resolution of the Kashmir issue, freedom's open wound that has, is, and will continue to threaten peace, prosperity, and stability in the region. A resolution of the dispute requires transcending the sterile hubris of territorial nationalisms of the Indian, Pakistani, and also the Kashmiri varieties. This can be achieved in large part by scholars and students as well as global citizens, deciding to go past presentism with all its muddled-headed dimness to rethink South Asia's future through a historical recovery of the region's rich and varied imagination, humaneness, and basic decency that has been lost sight of in the monolithic and toxic narratives of post-colonial nation states. Thank you very much.